Silvia at the beginning is the instrument of an anti-colonial movement. Now, I know that I'm doing many things for the moment to this conversation, but I think it is important because I think we need to realize, how fundamental the crisis that the 60s, reduced in the capitalist process of accumulation, capitalist work discipline, in basically the capitalist organizational work. How powerful it was. If we want to understand why, the 80s, 90s, and to this day, these 3 decades have seen such a vast and intense attack, on people's lives, people's ability on the conditions of our production, on people's ability to reproduce themselves, which, as I said before, has taken many forms, from land expropriation, the new wave of enclosures, of the cercamientos, to the attack on the welfare state, which is basically what we call welfare state, was the fact that because of many struggles, the state across the world basically had begun to invest part of the wealth that we had produced, into our reproduction. This is what we call the welfare state. The welfare state is really the fact that some of the wealth that people produce was returned in the form of subsidies, support to reproduction. Clearly, with in mind that by supporting our education, supporting our health, maybe supporting our capacity to have some housing, we will become more productive citizens and also more citizens that will be more accepting, of the political structure of capitalist society. So all of this, I'm saying that the reason why the attack has been so vast and so strong, continuing today, is very proportional to the fact that there was a real crisis. It was a real crisis. However, I would maintain that crisis in the last 2 decades has become also an instrument of discipline. The work used to be in the mid-70s, a real moment, of crisis in the accumulation process itself, has been converted in time into actually an instrument, right, to impose new forms of discipline. So that crisis now is continuously used to justify new forms of power, and basically to justify the major reorganization of work, the major reorganization of production that has given more power to the international capitalist class to command our labor, and has given them more power to also create new forms of division that in a way present an obstacle, to the creation of an alternative. Okay. Now, having presented this broad framework that I hope is sufficiently clear and obviously very limited in some ways, what I want to do now is to begin to look at what has been the role of feminist struggle and women's struggle in general, within this context. And as I mentioned, the feminist movement has been an important component. And what I mean by the feminist movement I do not mean, I do not prefer, but often I prefer to speak of the women's liberation movement because when I speak of the women's liberation movement, it seems to me that that concept reflects more directly what feminism was like, what feminism represented, in the early phase of the women's movement, in the early 70s, when it had really the quality of a mass movement, at least in a number of countries. It seems like a very important social force that mobilized a large number of women. And where often when we speak of feminist movements, we think of, which I do not share with this idea, but very often when people think of feminist movement, they think of organizations that have particular political positions. Now, the role of women's struggle and the role of feminist movement in the 70s was extremely crucial because it represented, feminism represented in a sense a very massive grassroots refusal of a certain sexual division of labor that in the history of capitalism had confined women to the process of reproduction and to a kind of work that had been completely invisibilized, completely naturalized, that had not even been considered as work, and had, in fact, not been remunerated in any way, and as a consequence, had condemned women to a situation, a condition of total dependence on men. Right? What the women's liberation movement represented was really a revolt against domestic work, a revolt against housework, at least in the form in which it had been experienced, in which it had been lived in many parts of the world. And it is not an accident that the epicenter, the beginning of the women's movement was Europe, and particularly certain parts of Europe and the United States. If we have time to discuss it, I like to reflect on the role, for instance, the World War II played in the beginning of the women's movement. I think that there are two contexts that have been very important for the take-off of the women's movement. Certainly one has been in the United States, the mobilization of the black African American population. That's always been true in the history, in American history. You find that even in the 19th century, the feminist movement of the late 19th century in the US were really triggered by the anti-slavery struggle. Because the anti-slavery struggle gave women power to move. They began to make a comparison between their position and the position of the slaves, and see that even though obviously the slavery of women in the home was widely different, nevertheless, there was a certain connection between the two. I would argue that something similar also happened, in the late 60s and 70s. That the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, certainly gave a tremendous power to women to move, right? And the militancy the men and women performed in the anti-war movement also was a factor, because they began to realize, by joining anti-war organizations, they began to realize that they were playing in this organization, they were playing the same role that they played in society at large. That, for example, the division, the sexual division of work continued in the movement. No? For example, women were also making parties, etc., etc. They were not those who took the strategic decision. The strategic decision, the public performances, they were always made by men. So this was another factor. But out of that, the World War II was also a very powerful factor in the development of the feminist movement, at least in the first phase. You know? During World War II, many women, for instance, went out to the home because the men were at the front, so they went out to the work, to the home, and took jobs in industry, often in the arms factories. And for the first time in their life, they experienced what it meant to have a rate of their own. They experienced what it meant to be with other women, not to be isolated in the home. At the end of the war, many of them returned, were actually pushed back to the home. But their lesson of independence was not lost, and they communicated it to their daughters. I think in many parts of Europe, the war also had a similar. I think there were other factors too. For example, I think that I come from Italy. I know that Italian women came out of World War II as different women. They realized through the war that the patriarchal family does not protect you. They realized that you could the sacrificial mother dedicated her life devoted to raising children was not really rewarded by the state as society because the children that she would raise, would be used, they sent to die in the war and be used as kind of fodder. And the great collapse of the birth rate that you have in Italy, for instance, after World War II, at the end of World War II, to these days, I know it's not unrelated to the lesson of the war. It certainly did have an effect on my life, because I grew up with the stories of the times the World War II was about. So I'm trying to build a context to explain why this rise of women in the 60s and 70s, why feminism, a movement don't come from nothing, not come from the vacuum. We always have to understand where movement, the fact that they appear suddenly on the historical scene, on the political scene, right, does not mean that they are spontaneous and immediate reaction. They have histories, they have long histories. But I'm reconstructing a bit of this history to, in a sense, try to understand what was the women's movement in some of its essence. The women's movement was really a challenge to a particular organization of the work, and to the kind of, it was a challenge to all this unpaid labor and the kind of social relations that had been constructed around it, that in a way confined women in their possibilities, in their social role, in their social function, and also created an identity, the whole identity community. Many women realized, starting with myself, that it was a cage. And the 60s and 70s gave us the power to break that cage, to begin to break that cage, right? And there's no question in my mind that the women's liberation movement was an important factor in the creation, an important contributor to the capitalist crisis of the mid-70s. So much so, that already by 1975, 1976, you have a major institutional intervention into the field of feminist politics. And I'm referring here specifically to the intervention of the United Nations, that with 4 conferences on women, the decade, the whole decade dedicated to women, right, in a way placed itself at the forefront of the emancipation of women. It put itself at the forefront of women's liberation. In reality, was, in my view, over time, a domestication of feminist politics. It was an undermining of the subversive character of feminism, of what was subversive in the feminist movement, and a strong attempt to redefine the feminist agenda, redefine it in ways that would be compatible with the kind of global restructuring, with the kind of neoliberal restructuring that was in fact underway. So I'm not an enthusiast of UN global feminism, and I think that as often, as it is often the case, women were able, women internationally were able to use this occasion, they were able to use these conferences to basically use them to get to know each other, create common agendas, but ultimately the intervention of the UN and the platforms that came out of those conferences had the net effect, had the result of stripping feminism, right, of its subversive character. And I raise this question, I bring this question but let me add another point that I think is important. The intervention of the UN, the intervention of the UN in the feminist field, is an expression of the fact that by the mid-70s, there was a realization at the institutional level, that some of the mechanisms by which the reproduction of the workforce have been organized, at least in the last, at least since the second half of the 19th century. The feminism meaning the family, housework, the hierarchy between wage labor and unwage labor. And this mechanism had to be organized because the women's liberation movement and the struggle of women were in effect a refusal of the kind of mediation that men had performed between women and the state, and between women and capital. I mentioned before that the women's movement was a refusal of the unpaid labor that traditionally performed from the home, right? It was also a refusal of the kind of mediation that men, have performed, in the sense that men had the link between women and capital, women and the state, right? In other words, traditionally in capitalism, the family has been a center of reproduction of labor power, a center of reproduction of the workforce, and where the man has played the role of supervisor of women's labor, and in a sense has been delegated the power, through the wage, delegated the power through the wage to command the work of women. Now, this mechanism was certainly put into crisis by the women's liberation movement and the women's struggle more generally. So, in a sense, the intervention of the United Nations had a double objective, a double role. On one side, changing the feminist agenda, in a way that could be reconciled with the goals of the neoliberal program, and specifically utilizing the demand coming from mainstream feminism for wage labor, for entrance to the places of work, traditionally being occupied by men, utilizing by demand, utilizing that claim by many families, by at least mainstream families, right, that women's liberation will be obtained through entrance into wage labor, utilizing that, in fact, to implement a reorganization in the workplace at a time in which the wage workplace was a place of crisis, was a place in which many workers was in a position of refusal. So I would say that in fact, through the organization of the many global conferences the United Nations has organized, there's been a process whereby, in a way, women have been channeled, into wage work, and at the same time, government has been educated to create new type of institutions, to create new forms of mediation, recognizing the changing mechanism of relation between women and men. In other words, the United Nations performed a tremendous work of through women's foundation and other forms of mechanism, trying to educate the institutional class to create the kind of to open up, the new spaces the women could occupy. But I think that this process has been a crisis for feminism and has been a crisis for the project that we represented. And this for me is the beginning of shifting more directly to a discussion of social crisis or social reproduction. What we're seeing in the last 3 decades, from the late 70s to present, has been a process whereby, in reality, a large number of women have entered the workforce, have entered the wage workforce. But women were not outside of the workforce before, except they occupied the space that was unwaged, and therefore invisibilized. So, large number of women have actually, what we are seeing as a major decomposition of the workforce internationally. And women now, for instance, in the United States, we have 60 to 70% participation of women in the workforce. At the same time, the assumption that many families had in the 70s, that this produced a major process of social transformation that would transform radically women's position in society, they would transform radically women's relation with men, and transform what we call the workplace as a whole, has not been realized. And in fact, what we've seen is that far from implementing a major social transformation, the feminist movement has not been able to contrast the kind of attack, the kind of the attack that has been moved against social reproduction, from the 70s to the present. And I'm going to be somewhat extreme in my statement, because I think that the situation in which we are today, it's a very critical situation. And I think it's very important to not nuance our understanding of the world. We are in a situation in which more and more people are living continuously on the verge of, on an emergency basis, on the verge of disaster in their life, and where we need quite intensive, creation of new alternative forms. So this is why I'm going to be but more critical in my view of the limits of the feminist movement with respect to its objective of power that perhaps to be. But to return to the relationship between the United Nations and return to what has resulted out of the strategies that the women's movement has adopted, or at least large part of it is adopted, I would say that since the 1970s, the movement has increasingly lost much of its power as a force of social change. And in many ways, it has not been capable of opposing the restructuring of reproductive work that is taking place internationally. This, I think, has been particularly true of the movement in the United States and less familiar with the movement in Europe. At the same time, new feminism are beginning to emerge today. But I want to return to the crisis that we are now experiencing, and which I think that the women's movement is not been able in many ways to confront. Today, we see that on a broad level, women have gained a certain autonomy from men. There is no question, for instance, that in many parts of the world, particularly in Europe and in the US, women have gained a certain amount of autonomy from men, precisely through engagement in wage work. So, but autonomy from men has not been, or relatively speaking, but it's not been autonomy from the structure of capitalist relation. In reality, what has taken place, and I'm sure that many of you are experiencing in your own life, is that women now have basically absorbed in their life, they are basically transformed in their life, a double or triple, shift of work that consume practically all their life, leaves almost no time for not only rest, but the kind of political work that the women's movement has begun. I know that this is beginning, I think this is beginning to change, but it's a crisis that we need to confront. The fact that the assumption the wage labor could actually liberate us, has resulted in a population of women whose work week and work day, recalls the work week and work day of the Industrial Revolution. 60, 70 hours of work are not unusual, particularly for women who have young children, or women who have to care for persons who are not self-sufficient, or care for relatives. 60, 70 hours a week are now the norm. And we speak of women who are sandwiched. They're really sandwiched between wage work, care of the elderly, the care of children, and in a way they have no time for themselves. One aspect of the crisis of social reproduction is what is a crisis that is evident in many women's lives, certainly in the United States, where women have become the main consumers of antidepressant medications because their life is a life of continuous work and anxiety about not being able to be present for the family, as well as anxiety about the dangers of losing their work, which is very precarious. And this is by itself a crisis of social reproduction, which then extends to all the members of the family. The decisions that are made to a certain type of feminism, which unfortunately has been able to shape what has become identified socially in the media as feminist politics. There's been a kind of redefinition of what feminism is meant, in which, as I mentioned, the United Nations is a role. The result of this kind of politics has been that very little time has been dedicated for women, and also a crisis has been opened that has extended to every member of the family. For example, today, we have a major, one of the most of the terrain in which the crisis is most evident, the crisis of reproduction, is children, childcare. Most of the services that were available have been either cut or they have been made so expensive that few women can afford them. There hasn't been the concentration that many families have made on struggling for entrance into male-dominated position and for achieving comparable wages for comparable work. The kind of exclusive concentration which has left, which has basically undermined to some extent the struggle over reproduction, has meant that when the state has begun to attack, we have to subsidize, publicly subsidize daycare. We haven't been able to have the strength to prevent it. So today, you have a whole population of children, right, who are in a situation that it's a crisis in itself, and not receiving the kind of care that they require. Added to that, of course, is the attack that has been made on the schools, that has been stripped. Many schools, public schools, have been stripped of many of the courses, of the activities that were most attractive. And we have now one result again this year, in the fact that according to national statistics, one child out of four, for instance, in the United States, is presumably suffering of mental disorders. I don't believe that this is a reality, but what we are witnessing slowly is a medicalization. It's a medicalization of the social crisis. It's a medicalization of the fact that we now live in a society where increasingly the resources and labor devoted to reproduction are continuously diminishing. In the schools as well as in the home. Similarly, the situation with the elderly, it's another terrain in which we can see the crisis in a very intense way. I'm always ironic about the fact that They tell us we're living longer and longer. And I think it's because they want to cut our pensions. In reality, if it is true that it will be longer, which I think if it is true, it's not so long, because life expectancy is collapsing across the world. In the United States, it's calculated that poor women have lost 5 years. In other words, if you have a poor woman, and especially the women of color, today in the US, you can expect to lose 5 years less than your mother. That's much for the statistics are terrible. Increase of suicide, increase of sedation, poverty, isolation. Many of the services that were in the since the 40s have been provided by the states for them. People visiting them in the home, people, nurses, aides, bringing food have been cut. And the family itself, the members of the families, are not there to provide the services. Now, of course, when I say these things, when I present this picture, it's pretty dismal, but I think it's better, it's also very real. To give you an idea of what the crisis is, one, not only we have seen the development of outsourcing of procreation, and outsourcing of reproduction, with the fact that many women now are having children through the mechanism of surrogacy. But we have also seen a process of outsourcing of elderly care, so that in a number of countries, we see the beginning of an export of the elderly in the family, particularly those with Alzheimer's, because the families do not have apparently time or resources to care for the elderly, at home. And so we are beginning to see not only the baby farms in Thailand or India, we are beginning to see elderly nursing homes in the same country who are now receiving and beginning to provide services for those who are now basically expelled from the families. So I think it's important to see this situation to, in a sense, break from the mystification that is often presented, that argues that the 1980s and 90s to this day has been period of great emancipation for women, and that the neoliberalism and opened up new possibilities, new resources, new forms of autonomy. In fact, I think that we need to reopen the family struggle in a way that begins to address the question of reproduction, returning to some of the themes and some of the demands that were originally shaped in the feminist movement of the 70s. And when I mean by family struggle, I do not mean only struggle by women, I also mean struggle by men. Feminism is not only labor women's struggle, it's also feminism implies a particular relationship to reproduction, in my view, implies a commitment against sexual discrimination, and in particular implies a commitment to a revalorization of the process of reproduction that in capitalism is structurally developed. So it is also true, however, that unless we begin the process of struggle to transform the communities, to transform the workplace, and to particularly, place reproduction at the center of our struggle. something that the women's movement has abandoned. I think unless we move in this direction, we are not going to be able to actually obtain, a victory in many other fronts. It seems to me that today the crisis of social corruption that I was illustrating, right, is a important exemplification of how, assuming that wage labor, assuming that the improving capitalist relations, can in any way be a path, to a life that is guaranteed and a life that corresponds to our desire. It's totally fallacious that the example of what has happened with the women's movement, it seems to me is an important lesson that we can learn from, because it has shown that shifting one form of exploitation to another, for example, exploitation as unpaid workers in the home, to exploitation as wage workers outside the home. First of all, the women have not left the home. Even when they've gone out by the thousands to work outside the home, they have continued to do a tremendous amount of hours. Actually, with the cuts, with the cuts in social services, a lot of housework has come back to the home. So there's been actually a return. But the idea that we can actually liberate ourselves through a transformation of this labor, and not through a serious mobilization over the terrain of reproduction, which I like to say is the terrain, the most central terrain, not only in our life, but in our struggle, for a different society. Because this reproduction is precisely the moment, is that terrain, in which all the power relations, all the forms of blackmail, all the ways in which we are being captured, in a capitalist society, are first, created, are first enforced. Right? In a way, the home is like a micro world in which all the structures that have imprisoned us or imprison us in capitalism are first implanted. And one of the themes of my political work and my writing has been exactly this theme, that in a way, unless we organize forms of struggle that centralize and place at the center of the struggle the question of the corruption, the challenge, the capitalist devalorization of this work, which is really a devalorization of our life. It's a devalorization of labor, it's a devalorization of the workforce, of the capacity to work, but in the end, it's a devaluation of our lives. That unless we start from this area, we will not be able to make any gain and truly create an alternative. We will only continue to shift from one form of exploitation to another, and in that process shift some of the work some of the forms of exploitation that we succeed in overcoming, shifted on the shoulders of other people. Because, let's not forget, going back to the question of the crisis, that even in time where that we will not consider time of crisis, for instance, the 50s or the 60s, let's imagine the 50s, when we had not full employment, but almost full employment, at least in Europe and the US. You had certainly For most of the world population, there was a crisis. Colonialism was a crisis. Right? Apartheid in the US was a crisis. So when we speak of crisis, when we speak of it, now we have a crisis, and a crisis of social reproduction, right? We need to really begin to reflect as to what we mean by crisis. Because for the millions and millions of people who throughout the history of capitalism and into the 60s and into the 70s, right, have been working in conditions of plantation, have been working in ways that have not been contractual, that have not been recognized, that have not been visibilized, that have not been considered as productive of social wealth. And certainly women as house workers have been part of this population, but they certainly have not been the only one. Right? For them, there's always been a crisis. So the crisis that we speak of today, is a crisis that in a way has very long roots, that continues a very long history. And a history that now is becoming more and more visible. I think that the power of today and the advantage that we have today with respect, for instance, to maybe the 60s or 70s, is that the process of globalization has made more evident, has made more clear to everybody across the planet, what in the past many times could be ignored. As made very clear, for instance, right, all the vast amount of unpaid labor that goes on in the home, that is been going on in the home. The women's movement has made that very evident, has brought that to the world attention through its refusal. Refusal is a great powerful mechanism because it makes visible what in the past was accepted and naturalized, right? It has made very evident also the role of colonial relations in the process of assimilation, right? And it has made particularly evident that we cannot hope to build a relation that guarantee our life and guarantee the possibility of a life according to our desire and a life in which we can be self-realized individually and collectively within the structures of capitalist society. Because if after 500 years of exploitation of the world, of exploitation of all the populations of the world, after 500 years of savage exploitation of the planet and its natural resources, the international capitalist class can turn to us wherever we are, in Bangladesh, in Spain, in Africa, and tell us, oh, we cannot have a pension, we are in a crisis, right? They can use the concept of a crisis to deny us the most basic forms of reproduction. If that is the case, right, then we have to realize that capitalism is not acceptable. Capitalism is not acceptable. And whatever form of struggle we live has to include within itself, or has to move in an horizon that aims to go beyond capitalist relations. Thank you very much.